So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the characteristics of life, and I'm going to be concluding with a discussion of evolution, which is something that we're going to see again and again and again in this class. So, what are the characteristics of all living things? Every single living thing on Earth, or anywhere else as far as we are aware, is composed of cells, and we're going to learn about cells later on this semester. But the cell is sort of the basic unit of life. The cell is the smallest thing that can be considered an individual. You are made up of cells. Your dog is made up of cells. Every living thing. Your houseplant is made up of cells. Every living thing is composed of cells. The second characteristic is that all living organisms have the ability to reproduce or pass on their genetics. So some organisms produce asexually, meaning they sort of just create clones of themselves. Some organisms reproduce sexually, meaning they have a genetic recombination. I shouldn't use the word recombination, but a genetic combination with another individual, which increases their diversity. And we'll talk about that later on. But all organisms, all life, has the ability to reproduce. The next thing is that all life, as far as we know, has DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. We're going to get into the details later on this summer, but all organisms, all living organisms have DNA. Okay? All living organisms pass on their genetic material through DNA. All living organisms maintain a relatively constant internal environment, or homeostasis is the term that we use for that. All living organisms are trying to keep their insides as the same as they possibly can. So your body, for instance, doesn't have massive temperature fluctuations, doesn't have huge changes in pH. Your body is trying to stay as same as it possibly can. All living organisms maintain homeostasis as far as we are aware. All living organisms can respond to their environment in some way. Okay, that includes plants. That includes fungi. Obviously, it includes animals. It includes bacteria and archaea. All living organisms respond to their environment. And later on, we're going to go through some examples of that. All living organisms can assimilate and use energy. They need to get their metabolic processes running, and so all living organisms use energy. We're going to talk about this one further, but life is highly organized compared to non-life. So living organisms are very organized. And then the last topic, which we're going to discuss more later, is evolution, or all organisms are going to adapt to their environment. And we're going to go into the details of that in a second, but these are, you should know these 7 things. Definitely be able to know what these 7 things are. That's going to be a question that I ask you, maybe on a test, maybe on a quiz, maybe both, but know those for sure. So the level at which life is organized, you can sort of go, here's where life really starts, is at the cellular level. You can't get smaller than cells and still be alive. I said that earlier, it's true. The cell is the smallest thing that is living. Get this menu to go away. Maybe I can't make the menu go away. That's all right. So atoms are sort of the smallest thing that you can have while still retaining its properties. Don't worry about that right now. We're going to talk about that shortly in chapter 2. But if you take a few atoms and you put those together, those form molecules. And atoms stuck together are molecules. If you take a few molecules, and if they're forming a living organism and you put those together, those form what's called an organelle. Not all cells have organelles, but some cells do have organelles, and we're going to talk about it's a pretty big distinction. It's pretty important which cells have them and which cells don't have them, but we'll get to that later on. Then we get to life, actual living things, cells. Cells are the smallest, I've blabbered about this for long enough, but cells are the smallest thing that you can have that is alive. If you put a bunch of cells together that have a common function, those form a tissue. If you put a bunch of tissues together that have a common function, those form an organ. What's potentially missing from this is an individual would go right underneath organ. Individual is the basic unit of ecology. That's not what we're studying right now, but cells can also be individuals, so it gets kind of weird, which is why I didn't include that here. But if you take a bunch of individuals and you stick them together, you get what's called a population. Okay, several populations living together along, well, not with their abiotic components, but several populations living together form a community. Okay, and we're skipping a lot of steps here, but all of the communities on the planet together form the biosphere, which you can't see because this stupid PowerPoint thing is in the way. That says biosphere down there. So again, here is your atom. Put atoms together. You put two of these hydrogens together with an oxygen, you form water. You put some of these waters together with more hydrogens and a bunch of carbon, you wind up forming an organelle. Organelles can form cells. These are muscle cells right here. You put a bunch of muscle cells together, you form a tissue. You put a bunch of tissues together, you form an organ. Maybe I just missed this earlier, but from there you can form an organism, like a human being. Put a bunch of human beings together, you form a population. You put a bunch of populations together, you form a community. Put a bunch of communities together and you form the biosphere. Okay, so these are levels that you should be aware of. These are things that you should know. I probably wouldn't ask you necessarily to recreate this. I might, but I probably won't. But you should be able to at least recognize these things. And if I give you like a multiple choice question, you should be able to put them together in order. Okay, what's larger, a molecule or an organelle? What's larger, a cell or an individual? Now, that's a trick question. In fact, if you would like a little bit of extra credit to partially see who's watching these, shoot me an email right now and tell me what is the difference between a cell and an individual, and maybe do a little research and tell me why is it that those two things could potentially be the same thing. So the last topic I'm going to talk about in this lecture is evolution. Okay, there are a lot of misconceptions about evolution out there, but evolution is the gradual modifications of populations of living organisms over time. So the basics of what happened in evolution are you have a group of organisms that has limited resources. That's one of the principles of evolution, is that resources are always limiting in nature. And so as a result of that lack of abundance of resources, individuals begin competing with one another, and the individuals that are best suited for that particular environment wind up winning out. When those individuals win out, they are able to then pass their DNA on to the next generation. And that is the basics of evolution. If you want a very sort of microevolutionary definition, I would say evolution is a change in the allele frequencies within a population over time. Don't worry about that answer. But evolution is simply the gradual change of populations of organisms throughout time. Okay. And it shapes the appearance of different species. It could be internal appearance. It could be external appearance. Why is it this way? I just answered that question. Organisms are competing with one another. the best survive, survival of the fittest, they pass their genetics on. So this is my study specimen. This is a genus called Spearia. These are a group of incredibly closely related butterflies. They're so closely related that actually if you try to cross them within a lab, they can actually interbreed. They are very closely related to one another. They're a super new species, but they're all quite different looking. In fact, these are Spearia down here. These are in North America. This is Fabriciana, and this is Organelles up here. And they're super closely related to each other. It's a fantastic example of a very modern form of evolution. It's still taken about 1 million years, but it's just super cool to look at. If you ever want to chat about evolution, hit me up and we'll talk about it. I think that's all I'm going to do for chapter 1.